I'm not going to try to give this talk in Polish because I would murder your language, which would be a big diplomatic problem. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about an architect in whom I've had some interest for a number of years. I was a student here in Krakow, as Dorota said, in the 1980s, and I was always struck by Szyszko-Bohusz's work. It caught my eye, and I've never really written about it until the foundation invited me to do so this year. And so this is a chance to reflect a little bit on Szyszko-Bohusz. And I'm speculating here. Maybe some of the things I'm going to say are very speculative, but maybe they might also provoke some discussion. So my talk is on Szyszko-Bohusz and history and power. Well, this exhibition's a really fine exhibition. It's a really generous and thoughtful exhibition. But in a way, it seems to me that this exhibition is late. Seems an odd thing to say, late. But what I mean is, it's perhaps surprising that the spotlight was not put on Szyszko-Bohusz's work earlier. And what I mean by this is, there are strong affinities between Szyszko-Bohusz's work and a generation of architects across Europe of the same period and thinking as him, who were discovered in the 1980s and 1990s, that they had the spotlight, but Szyszko-Bohusz did not. So the most obvious candidate for this would be Plečnik, a Slovene architect who works in Ljubljana and in Prague, particularly after 1918, producing a very sort of poetic or lyrical response to the traditional classical languages of architecture. We might add to this Asplund, who is pretty much the same generation as Szyszko-Bohusz. He was born in 85 in Stockholm. And he's a kind of representative of a kind of very spare Nordic classicism. Again, a figure who had the spotlight in the 1980s. Or we might think about Saarinen from Finland, but I'm thinking more particularly about his time when he worked in the USA after 1923, producing buildings and designs for buildings which again have this dialogue with architectural classicism. And finally, we might stretch a bit, and we might say that Adolf Loos shares some affinities with well-known figures, a little bit older, but still Adolf Loos, who seems to share some of these echoes that I'm going to describe today in Szyszko-Bohusz's work, a particular interest in materials like marble, for instance. So, there's a set of architects, largely born in the 1870s or the 1880s. They're all architects who begin their career before the First World War. And actually, intellectually, they seem to be shaped by late 19th century thinking. So they all express ideas about the role of the artist or the architect as somebody who gives creative expression to form. They all seem to be drawn to an idea that the art historian Riegel described as Kunstwollen, which I suppose is a sort of deep-seated need for human expression. So, when Szyszko-Bohusz at the beginning of his career is reflecting on what a conservator might be, he said, our conservator should be, above all else, an artist. So a conservator should not necessarily be a historian or a technician, they should be an artist. That seems to me an expression of that kind of regal idea. And when this generation of architects turned to traditional architectural forms, like, for instance, the column here, they all treat classical architectural languages not in terms of fidelity to tradition. They all seem to be interested in using this language in what I would call idiosyncratic ways. They try to use the language of classicism for extraordinary poetic effects, like this Ben mausoleum and monument that we're going to see more of later. And I think also this is a generation formed around 1900 professionally who were very interested in what we might call craft skills, very interested in the architectonic properties of materials. And when you think about Szyszko-Bohusz's attachment to stone, as you walk through the exhibition, you'll see this recurrent use of stone. I think this probably is indebted to a kind of late 19th century worldview about the proper materials for architectural form. So, these were pre-First World War generation, but they're interesting because their careers last so long. Some of them are designing well into the 1930s, even into the Cold War. Plečnik is still active at the beginning of the 1950s. Szyszko-Bohusz lived until 1948. I hope I've got that right. There's some nodding. That's very good. And I was really struck by this. Szyszko-Bohusz is the editor of this magazine in 1926, and it features Malevich on the cover. Here we see his editorship. Something very striking about a generation that's active before the First World War encounters modernism of the kind expressed by Malevich, or maybe machine age aesthetics, but also continues after the Second World War. This is an extraordinary spectrum of a career. And I think intellectually forming around 1900, this generation, they're not swept up by the modern movement. They're not swept up with the ideas of machine age aesthetics, which we see in Poland in the work of Berlewy, or we read Szymon Surkus, who says, in this age of industry, we can have a furniture machine, we can have an apartment machine, we can have a town machine. This generation are not swept up in machine age aesthetics, but they have to form some kind of relationship to it. And maybe that's what this exhibition is about. What kind of relationship to modernity was articulated in Szyszko-Bohusz's work? And in a way, I detect in this work, in this lyrical work, a kind of resistance, a resistance to machine age aesthetics. There's a persistent appeal to the transcendental, to the sublime in this work. And this generation of architects are often called in to design cemeteries, to design churches, to design graves. So I think their work offers the possibility of some kind of symbolic language that goes beyond function, goes beyond utility. And I think this symbolic language of churches and graves also lends itself to another kind of sublime, which we might call the national sublime, the idea of creating a pantheon at Wawel, or working on Prague Castle as Plečnik did. That somehow this symbolic force of architecture was being driven by these particular figures. I also think that these figures are kind of peripheral. They're peripheral because history pushes them sideways. That to be on the wrong side of Europe during the Cold War, wrong, in inverted commas, means that figures like Plečnik were not really attended to during their careers. And it's only at the very end of the 1980s that Plečnik suddenly is put under the spotlight. There is an exhibition at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris in 1986. A really wonderful book appears in 1989. So these figures on the edge of Europe start to get attention in the 1980s. And I think their work was very amenable to the kind of language-based ideas around architecture, which were very current in the 1980s. Architecture was encouraged to be symbolic, to be an expressive response to the languages of architecture. And we see works like these being very playful responses to classicism, trying to reduce architecture to signs, to symbols, and in a way, a kind of fashion for a kind of postmodern sensibility puts the spotlight on figures like Plečnik. Also, I think that postmodernism tried to make a claim, and you see it at the top here for the Venice Biennale in 1980. that the past was still with us, that the past is present, that the past is still here with us. And maybe the challenge for architects is to somehow engage with that living sense of past. So you have these amazing things in the 1980s happening, I think a little bizarre. There's a tremendous rediscovery of Speer, the architect who'd worked for the Third Reich. He's promoted by Leon Krier, who you see here. Krier writes a book at the early 1980s who says, this architect who worked for the Third Reich was a great architect, but somehow subscribed to bad politics, and we need to separate the politics from the architecture. That this, the Zeppelin field, is somehow great architecture, and that we can ignore the fact, or escape the fact, that he was also Hitler's Minister of Armaments. So a kind of interesting attempt to rewrite architectural history in the 1980s. And also a very strong fascination with reconstruction, with restoration, with tradition. So the same figure, Leon Krier, says the job of architects is to manage the past and the present. That we have to look back to somehow a kind of pre-industrial age, before modernity sent us on the wrong path, and we will find beautiful cities of stone. And the challenge of architects in the 1980s, it seemed, was not simply to create the new, but was also to manage the old, often in rather theatrical ways. So if you think about this work by Miralles, which has architectural details taken from a 1930s building that are reused to make this very current piece of postmodernism. Or a British example would be David Chipperfield, whose architecture tries to fold past and present together. And I think in a way you could probably look at Szyszko-Bohusz and you could say, yeah, this question of how to manage the past is also his question, but it was a one 50 years earlier. So we can think about Szyszko-Bohusz as architect, as preservationist. We can think about him as idiosyncratic classicist, little echoes of that postmodern thing there. We can think about him as a kind of expressive modernist. And we can all think about him as a kind of an eclectic, somebody who mixes different architectural languages together. So he was ready in the 1980s. He was ready to be rediscovered, but he wasn't. And it seems to me there's a kind of question about why that was not the case. And this is what I mean by saying that somehow this exhibition, this great exhibition, is also kind of late in a way. Now, of course, it's very difficult to explain why something did not happen. It's very difficult to explain why the spotlight was not put on Szyszko-Bohusz in the 1980s. And I know there was an exhibition in 1989 here. Maybe it's because the postmodernist discourse here in Poland was not very developed. Or maybe it's because Polish culture was preoccupied with other things in the 1980s to be worrying about these kinds of questions. And actually, of course, there were Polish postmodernists, but what were they interested in? They were interested in much more legible symbols, churches that behave like arcs, or churches which behave like kind of cosmic gateways. So, anyway, I suppose this is a bit of a diversion because it's clearly not the postmodern Szyszko-Bohusz which is being desired today. In fact, this exhibition seems to desire something else altogether. It really wants to draw our attention to Szyszko-Bohusz's relationship to modernism. And I think we should ask the question, why? So if we consider this really, I think, lovely design by Joanna Sowula from the catalogue, but also this montage effects in the show. If we look carefully at it, what we're seeing are kind of quotations of Corbusian icons. So the Villa Savoie features down here. Inside there's the modular, the figure that Corbusier developed with Yoshi Sultan at the end of the First World War. So a very kind of strong, emphatic emphasis on the universal languages of modernism. These quite nice jokes. So we have the the seminarium, which is turned into a kind of tribune, a stand for a Polish legionnaire. We also have this parapet on the Phoenix building, which is set crooked in a kind of constructivist style. So it's really emphatically playing these games with the language of modern architecture. So why? Why do we want to make Szyszko-Bohusz a modernist? Why is that important for us now? Why do we want to create a relationship to an architectural culture that's now 60 or 70 years old? And I don't think this is just a question for us in this room. It's not just a question for the curators of the show. I think it's also a question of the moment. Because if we look across Europe and North America, we see a kind of hunger for the modern movement of the 20s and 30s again. This is a hunger that's been around for maybe 10 or 15 years. And it's thrown up some interesting things. Firstly, I'll give you two examples. Example one is a strong desire to try and capture what's sometimes called regional modernisms, local inflections of the universal. There's been a lot of discussion, for instance, of this building. This is often claimed, my side, as an example of a kind of regional or local modernism made in Mexico City. It's the studios of the artists Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. The architect, Gorman, designed these two cubic boxes which sit on kind of slender stilts on kind of pilotti, and they're connected by this bridge walkway between the two. And for a number of years, when people looked at this building, they wanted to say it's a kind of copy of the Aux Enfants studio that Corbusier had designed in 1922, that this is indebted to Corbusier. But increasingly, historians are trying to think about how this is not like Corbusier, in fact, how this building is different to Corbusier. So a lot of thinking about the nature of the colour. Where does that colour come from? Maybe that colour is related to kind of vernacular, local building traditions in Mexico City. And then details like this fence, you can see it here in close-up, which is called a pipe organ fence, using cacti, these spiky plants. This is cultivated, it's been grown in the manner of a Mexican peasant. And it makes this really striking contrast with the kind of ducts and the reinforced concrete stairwell and these metal window detailings. This is all about playing up a difference between local and the universal. And then that bridge. In a way, there's something interesting going on here because we have Kahlo's studio and Rivera's studio. These two lovers separate themselves. And this is a kind of clear view of Kahlo's desire to have a kind of independent life, not to be dependent on the better-known Rivera, not to be dependent on bourgeois marriage. So suddenly this building's really interesting because it's tied to these social challenges. How do we have a different kind of social relationship? But it's drawing its language from the vernacular and from the universal modern. And the only way to think about this is to see it as a kind of response or a dialogue with these universal patterns of modernism. So this is a kind of regional modernism. So that's one example. The second shift that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is an attempt to try and think about the idea that modernism doesn't always infer progressive politics. So a lot of scholars have become very interested in modernism in fascist Italy. The idea that the fascist state, the authorities, called upon, they drew on modernist architects like Terrani right up until the mid-1930s. So famously, his fascist headquarters in Como is really an amazing building. It's based on this sort of play of volumes and voids. It's all full of refractions and screens, all producing this extraordinary kind of abstract effect. And in a way, we can't deny the modernity of this building. This is a sort of extraordinarily bold piece of modernist architecture. Terrani, when he described it though, didn't talk about its exceptionalism. He didn't talk about its bold claims on being an architecture of the future. He simply said, this is Mussolini's vision. So he said, here's a building that's made of glass that you can see through. That's Mussolini's vision. What could be more transparent than the building that you look through? Of course, it's a complete fraud. But this reference to power, to say, here is a building that articulates an ideological vision, perhaps we might call this reactionary modernism. Reactionary modernism. And of course, the book and the exhibition here seem to kind of hint at something of this discussion. The title of the exhibition suggests that Szyszko-Bohusz's work is a kind of reaction to the modern. It's got an echo of that phrase, reactionary modernism, about it. There's a kind of hint of some kind of politics at work here, maybe a reactionary politics. But still, I'm bypassing my question. Why are we so interested in modernism today? Why is it that we'd like to make such a claim that Szyszko-Bohusz was a modernist architect? And I think it's true to say that some of his works, his most significant works, fit the bill. They fit the canon. They are closely tied to politics of the period, presidential villa, and they're distinctly modernist works. This is a really extraordinary building, I think, this series of flat-roofed geometric volumes that sit high on this hilltop in the mountains, with a relatively free plan of flowing spaces, furnished with tubular steel furniture, which we see in the exhibition, vividly coloured walls, amazing colour scheme by Pronaszko. And we also know that this building was a gift. It was a tribute to Mościcki, who himself was a kind of modernizer in Poland. You'll know this very well. And in a way, this is an extraordinary building. If we looked at every presidential residence across Europe in the 1930s, maybe only one building would come close in terms of this modernist standard to the one that we see in Wisła. And that would be the Ataturk residence in Floria, which is a kind of floating platform as a kind of piece of dramatic modernism. So this is special in Poland, the idea that a presidential villa could assume that language. And of course it's sort of fitting for Mościcki, because Mościcki, politician but also scientist, has a good CV as a kind of modernizer, as a figure behind these chemical works in Tarnów. And in an interesting way, we could even push this into the space of the avant-garde, that factory was somehow prefigured in the Universal National Exhibition in Poznan in 1929, in this remarkable pavilion by Circus and members of the Presens group, who again are producing a building which is an emphatic claim on modernity, framed within these modernizing politics of the Second Republic. Remember, he said, industrialization gives us furniture machine, apartment machine, town machine. This is being played out here. So perhaps the appeal of this modernism is to do with trying to make a strong connection between the present and the 1920s and 1930s. Maybe to say something about the fact that Poland was an industrializing country during the Second Republic, and that in a way this bypasses the story of the PRL, which is about a failure of industry, a failure of modernity. And maybe this is important. Andrzej Ścierski's here, and this is his book, and I think it's part of the argument that's made by the book, to say, let's attend to this period. So we have scholars, we have artists thinking about this, and I haven't seen this book yet, but I read about it in the paper. We have it in the popular imagination. There's a new graphic novel on Gdynia. So somehow in Poland there's a kind of preoccupation with trying to think about the interwar period in some ways. What that is about, maybe we can talk about. So we can say the Zamek was of strongly, as a bravura piece of modernist architecture. But I don't think we should overlook all the other things it was too. It's got all these picturesque elements. It's got a kind of aristocratic quality, a castle on a hill. It's got this use of traditional building materials, this sandstone that's cladding the building and so on. So all of this raises a problem. How do we reconcile the modern aspects, the modernist aspects in Szyszko-Bohusz's work with everything else he does. And maybe one way of trying to answer that question is to think about the difference between rupture, the break between then and now, and the politics of continuity, the idea that tradition is something to be organized and managed into the present. And it seems to me that Szyszko-Bohusz never disavows the past. He never does the thing that so many other modernists do, which is to emphasize the new spirit, l'esprit nouveau, the new life, novi bit, Tatlin, or the new Frankfurt, Neuer Frankfurt. This emphatic emphasis on the new is an emphasis on rupture, on revolution, on change. Szyszko-Bohusz doesn't seem to do that. I think even the most modernist of his works have a kind of vein of antiquarianism running through them. They have a sense of connection to the past, even to a deeply historic past. And what I'd like to do in the second half of this talk is now show you that at work, show you that in a couple of buildings. So, Dorota, in her kind introduction, talked about the significance of this space. And I suppose I looked at this a lot when I was here. I was always slightly confused by this entrance to a crypt. I thought it was a kind of odd piece. When I looked at it, it always looked strangely postmodern, even though it's a building, a structure from mid-1930s. Now, to understand this building, we have to know a bit about its history. And of course, it's deeply symbolic structure, but it was also a very practical structure. It was a practical solution to a problem between the bishop, Sapieha, and the authorities in Poland, a kind of sharp disagreement about how to manage Pilsudski's remains, but also his reputation. His funeral had taken place in Wawel in May 35, some years before this structure was built. Pilsudski's body, you probably know, had been embalmed. It had been displayed with these relics, his saber, his maciówka, and he'd been placed in a glass coffin. I think it's really extraordinary that he's inside a glass coffin. People in glass coffins usually are in fairy tales. People in glass coffins are not dead, they're just asleep. And maybe there's some kind of implication of this. Also, the idea of the glass coffin looks like a kind of crystal object. And crystal objects have been a sort of symbolic structure in Krakow school expressionism, Tchaikovsky and so on. Anyway, initially his coffin is placed in the St. Leonard crypt. He's alongside Kościuszko, I think. But this couldn't be a permanent arrangement. And in fact, the coffin was failing. It was supposed to be airtight, but air was getting in, and his body was decaying. So a new coffin was prepared, again designed by a kind of Krakow school figure, Szczepkowski, but it was a failure too. This continued to decay. And actually the crypt itself was kind of inadequate. People were turning up really to pay reverence, but they were eating and drinking in the space. And the bishop felt that this was an entirely inappropriate use of the space. So there was a tension, a kind of standoff between church and state over this. And a solution was found, a solution to extend the crypt under the Tower of the Silver Bells, allowing a kind of separate entrance to to come and visit Pilsudski's remains. Szyszko-Bohusz was commissioned. You can see the work in the show. And his initial designs for this kind of winged hussar on this kind of Gothic temple were kind of extraordinary and grand. But what prevailed was much smaller, much less theatrical. And I suppose it's worth pointing out some of the elements here. We have a building or a structure that owes a lot to a kind of classical lexicon. It's got Corinthian columns. It's got these balustrades running low down. It's got this Latin inscription. The body's asleep, but the spirit's still alive. And it seems to me, it always looked to me slightly odd, slightly idiosyncratic. When I looked at this structure, it's as if some of the parts don't perform their conventional functions very well. that these columns don't meet this platform above, that there is a small post between column and platform. And that has the effect of making that platform-like structure seem to just float, seem to just lift slightly. Maybe it's this kind of symbolic, sublime language I talked about earlier. And then these vertical lines of the crosses puncture that material. And you can see that these military crosses sit at the top. So there's something kind of odd about the treatment here. So what's being remembered in this structure? What is it doing? How does it operate as a memory work? Well, one thing is it always strikes me as being quite small when we might compare it to other structures of the period. Think about the Liberation Monument in Prague, built 28 to 38, so quite comparable in honor of the Czechoslovak legions that had fought in the First World War. A monstrous structure overlooking Prague. Start to think about scale. Or a leading centralizing figure like Ataturk. If you look at his mausoleum, which is completed during the 1940s, again, this is monumental in its scale. And it makes me think that this entrance structure is actually relatively modest, relatively small. And one way of thinking about this is to draw down on a classical idea, to see the structure as what we might call an edicula. An edicula is a particular building form which was used during the Roman Empire. It was often an addition, a small building which extended a larger structure. And it might be something like a shrine. It might be the place where you would keep your family gods, just attached to your building, the building that you live in. So it's a kind of ceremonial architecture. It's an architecture whose primary function is something like tribute or memory. And it seems to me that we might see this Pilsudski structure, Szyszko-Bohusz's design, as an edicula. There are lots of them throughout architecture. They were fashionable in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of postmodern gesture. So this is Charles Moore's own home, and that's his bath, which has an edicula above it. But we might also sort of see echoes. I don't know, maybe we might see the Barcelona pavilion as an edicula. I don't know, maybe there's a possibility for thinking this through as an idea. And then we start to see echoes in the materials. I don't know. So, strangely domestic, strangely small, this is not Witkov. This is not the Ataturk mausoleum. And in fact, there's a big contrast between the kind of high ceremony, the high rhetoric of Pilsudski's state funeral, and then actually what remains in terms of its architectural expression, I think. Of course, just to take a little detour, there were attempts to monumentalize Pilsudski in the 1930s, serious attempts. Within just a few days of the Marshal's death in 1935, Polish architects stood up and said, we want to build a massive memorial to Pilsudski, and we're going to do this in the form of a grand urban ensemble. We're going to take the Pole Mokotowskie, the Mokotów fields, and we're going to drive a park through them and major thoroughfares. So this is an article that was published by Stanisław Brukalski in the major architectural magazine in the middle of the 1930s. And he said this is going to be like a Polish Avenue des Champs-Élysées, or this is going to be like Central Park in New York, or the Alta Sea in Hamburg. Of course, this is architects looking for work, proposing a big scheme that will put them in employment. But I think it's more than this. It's about saying that modern architecture can organize the world. We can plan the world around this. I'm very struck by the range of references that sit in this piece, this proposition, for a memorial to Pilsudski. So here we have the classic rhetoric. Our aim is to honor the memory of Pilsudski. This new area of Warsaw will be an open temple to the Polish nation. It's like a claim on making a new Wawel or something. So I'm kind of surprised that Brukalski, who's a a major modernist architect. He's a member of Siam. He's associated with Presens and so on. He's using the rhetoric of the 19th century, the temple of the Polish nation. I think that Brukowski is particularly stirred, he's particularly energized by looking to Italy. He's looking to Mussolini. And particularly, he's trying to think that this Pole Mokotowskie could be a new Via del Impero, an imperial avenue, which Mussolini was at that time driving through the center of Rome. In this image, Mussolini seems to be doing it himself. It's a grand, hubristic project in Italy to connect ancient Rome with Italy in the 1930s. It's to say then and now are the same thing. The site in Rome was to be a kind of wedge running between Mussolini's own headquarters, which were in the Piazza Venezia, but leading up to the Colosseum. So it's a kind of journey in space, but also a journey in time. And that new buildings were planned for this site. So Terrani, from Como, he proposed this building, which was to be a fascist headquarters sitting along this new imperial avenue. Other figures offered more classically inflected structures. And for architectural history, this is the battle between rationalists, between modernists, and between classicists over who will win Mussolini's hand. Will Mussolini fall in love with the modernists or with the traditionalists? Now, this was never constructed, but it's the point of reference for Brukowski. Brukowski seems to be so interested in trying to find a kind of fascist equivalent for Warsaw. It didn't happen in the way that he planned in Warsaw, but there was already a scheme. A scheme had been running for a number of years in Warsaw to remodel what was already called Plac Pilsudski, Pilsudski Square, which had been named that in 1928. The aim was to take this area that you'll know very well and to remodel it, to reorganize it in a way that was fitting for the capital of a powerful Central European country. This building at the center, the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, had already been destroyed. It was destroyed in 24 to 26. Some protests, some discussion, but a great deal of pleasure in the destruction of this building. And a kind of discussion was underway about how to reorganize the center of Warsaw. So here's what the modernists wanted to do, which is to drive a major road through the center of the city. This is Lachert and Brukowski, some major figures, who imagine on the side of the Vistula we can have these wonderful kind of curved slabs, which would be high-rise blocks, that they would drive through the center of the city, and there would be underground passes through the city. So for modernists, the idea of a monument to Pilsudski could be accommodated within their bigger vision. Szyszko-Bohusz was in this competition. So this is his proposal for the remodeling of Pilsudski Square. The image is a bit hard to follow, but I've kind of highlighted parts. This kind of axis or this route driven through the center of Warsaw would end with the Saxon Palace, which has the tomb to the unknown soldier at its heart. It would also, en route, either take into account this kind of Colosseum-like structure, or, if this was unsuccessful, a kind of Arc de Triomphe. And as you walk through the show, you'll see echoes of that space, a space of which he reuses a number of times. Now, what I'm trying to do here is talk about scale a bit. On the one hand, we have something that seems truly monumental, that seems to want to make a big claim for Pilsudski's reputation, and then also something that seems to be on a more reduced scale. But in my mind, they're connected, that these two things sit very closely together for a particular reason. And to make the connection, it might be useful to think about spolia. Spolia, as you may know, is the classical tradition of gathering the arms of the defeated and making some kind of monument to show that your victory is complete by completely appropriating their weapons. And of course this is an example of spoiler. The entrance to the crypt had been fashioned from various kinds of trophies which had been taken from the partitions, from Russia, from Polish Austria, from the German parts of Poland. So the stonework that we see here comes from Poznan, and it comes from this plinth which once supported a statue to Bismarck. The jade marble columns, they come directly from the Nevsky Cathedral, which had been dynamited 10 years earlier. And they come from this interior, which had been designed by Szyszko-Bohusz's professor in St. Petersburg. And then the octagonal bases and the columns had been recast from metal from Austrian guns. And of course, Austrian guns had been used in Krakow in the middle of the 19th century to bombard the city. So what we have here is a composite made of all of these different historical elements. It's spoiler. But there's something very particular about this use of spoiler. Conventionally, spoiler gets its meaning when you can see the wound or you can see the source of the material. When we look at this, we probably don't have any sense of Bismarck in Poznan or Austrian guns or the Nevsky Cathedral. There is no kind of open wound to which this is pointing. And this idea is most clear if we think about the grave to the unknown soldier in Warsaw today. The meaning, the energy of this object, I think, is not so much derived here, but in here, in the exposed brickwork. That is the wound in this building. So what's so striking about this design is it doesn't really point to its origins. Its origins are supplied beyond the object. They're supplied in words. They're supplied in images. So this is a building that doesn't have any marks, doesn't have any patina. It's a structure that seems to be complete and resolved. And maybe that's its point. Maybe it's a kind of allegorical form that talks about unity, a kind of reuniting. And in a way, I think this is part of Szyszko-Bohusz's 19th century worldview that kind of says, we need to reunite the nation. This is precisely what's happening here. I think there's also something interesting. We've got sort of 10 minutes more. If you can cope with me, I'm going to take us through a couple of other ideas. The idea that death is a kind of motivating spirit has been something that the Poles have very often told themselves. It's part of the romantic imagination, that death measured sacrifice, that the bodies of exiled poets, soldier poets after their death, returned to the nation, constitute a kind of evidence of the coherence of the nation despite the frailty of those bodies. And I think this entrance to the crypt really owes a lot to this 19th century romantic imagination. There's another example of this in the show, Szyszko-Bohusz's setting for the sarcophagus of another 19th century hero, Józef Bem. And of course, you know that Bem dies effectively in exile in Aleppo, but in the late 20s there's a desire to bring his remains back to Poland, to be transported to his birthplace in Tarnów, and that a long procession is made through not just Poland but also Hungary, where finally his body arrives, his coffin arrives to Tarnów, and it's reinstalled in this mausoleum, in this extraordinary architectural object which places Bem high above the ground on the top of these 6 tall columns in the middle of a lake in a picturesque park, an utterly extraordinary proposition, with these stone spheres at the base that suggest cannonballs and so on. On the top, the columns support this stone sarcophagus, and inside the sarcophagus we have his body, but we also have earth gathered from around the world and so on, from the places where he'd fought his battles. Now, there are echoes, historical echoes, in these elevated sarcophagi, but I don't really think that this is what Szyszko-Bohusz is doing here. I think he's trying to produce a kind of legible architecture parlante, a kind of speaking architecture that wants to tell us something about sacrifice or valor. Okay, so in my final section, it's quite warm in here. Everybody okay? You've got 10 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is try and take the themes that I've talked about so far, which are about the past, and to try and project them into buildings that seem to be much more self-consciously modernist. So I'm trying to draw connections here. A lot of Szyszko-Bohusz's modernist schemes of the 1930s, to me, seem to have echoes of this edicular structure, these small temple-like structures, which are used sometimes as doorways or entrances. So this is from this hydroclinic from 1930. But I think you could also see the edicular just round the corner in Oleandry, where we can see this Pilsudski house sharing some of these kind of classical tendencies that I've already described. As you probably know, this building was created in the 1930s, but was really part of an institution that was trying to mark the importance of the legions in Polish life and in the formation of the New Poland in 1918. It was to be home of a Museum of Independence, which would gather objects. So these are some of the exhibits from this museum, and would tell the story of the formation of the legions on the very ground where those historical events had happened. So this is all full of high emotional symbolism. Now, if we look at this building today, or we look at it in its original form, it looks like a marked version of a kind of classic piece of modernist design. It's quite abstracted. It looks rather more avant-garde, I think, than Szyszko-Bohusz ever intended. So we have this central vertical block organized over 5 stories. And then behind it, in a kind of staggered profile, we have this shorter 4-story block. So the effect is very dynamic, particularly when it's photographed at some kind of angle. We have this kind of step-like profile. Here we have a lot of glass, so this central stairwell, I think, is extremely illuminated, particularly at night when it kind of radiates out. And then that service block is like this lighthouse. It stands at the top and projects light into the world. So a kind of staggered profile and a building that somehow is like a beacon. All of this looks like a remarkable piece of modernism. But we have to remember that this building is an incomplete building. It is just one wing of what was proposed to be a much larger structure, a much larger complex. And that in the full design for the building, 3 wings were to be organized around a courtyard. And that this courtyard would be connected by this elevated double height arcade running through here. So we have to look at the overall project and start to see that it actually contains very conventional architectural elements. It's got an axial, symmetrical arrangement that looks much more like a classical Greek temple than perhaps we might imagine. I think it also has some echoes of the Pergamon altar, which had just been opened in Berlin in 1930 and was a big cause célèbre around the world. A lot of attention was given to this altar. It also looks a bit like a gymnasium. In the classical world, the training zone for young athletes and soldiers, but also a kind of meeting place of poets, the poet-soldier, Mickiewicz and so on. Again, it's an arcade structure, usually framed through a framed courtyard. And we can also see lots of other kind of echoes that are far closer to home. That neo-Saxon classical structure, that neoclassical Saxon palace structure, which had been remodeled in the 1840s in Warsaw. And I can't keep on going, but the more I looked, you see endless repetitions of this formal structure being played out in Szyszko-Bohusz's work, but also in Poland at the time. And I think all of this is probably to be read metaphorically, to say the legions are this classical brotherhood of warrior poets who have strong affections to a powerful state, and that somehow this building is a kind of call to arms that speaks of the past. Lots of contemporaries in Europe looked at Pilsudski, and they looked at Mussolini, and they tried to draw connections. Trotsky writes very vividly about the relationship of the two. And I think these echoes are sort of interesting because if you read the architectural press in Poland, Polish commentators are looking all the way through the 1930s to Italy, that Mussolini's Italy provides a kind of model. But it's an ambiguous model, and I'm just finishing to make that comparison into a kind of question. We know that in Italy, traditionalists and modernists are fighting, they're vying with each other. Which one will come to represent the state? And even the most ambitious of these rationalist figures want to somehow make their work speak to tradition. They want to make it legible in terms of Italian fascist politics. So I've described this building as a modernist cube, voids, screens and so on. But we have to also think about it as being a palazzo. It belongs to a deep tradition of architectural form in Italy. So we could start to say, yeah, is this the same thing? Are we looking at a parallel history that puts Szyszko-Bohusz's work for the Pilsudski house into a relationship with this fascist headquarters in Como, that somehow these are kind of sisters? And I wouldn't be the first to do this. In Poland in the 30s, writers are making that connection very strongly. But I'd also like to put some limits on it. This is my final couple of images. I can't think of anything in Poland which is as bizarre as what we find in Italy. So just giving one example, the Foro Mussolini, which is a kind of classical sports stadium in 1928 being built as part of this gesture of reclassicizing Rome, has these mosaics running across the floor which have these fascist troops on the back of these lorries driving. And there's nothing as incoherent as this found, I think, in Poland, but maybe you can set me right. So I think we can put some limits on the comparison, but it's worth thinking about. And maybe it's part of a more general turn towards classicism, towards monumentalism, across left and right in the 1930s. So to end, what I kind of like about these designs is they put pressure on Szyszko-Bohusz, on his status as a modernist. Because I don't think he's a modernist in the sense of somebody who's committed to the fragment, to the language of rupture and revolution, to the new, to collage, all of those things which were at the heart of many other modernist practices. If anything, I think Szyszko-Bohusz is much more interested in continuities, connections, in traditions, and that his designs have their kind of feet, their footing in the classical world. They want to claim a kind of classicism. And you know, for a Polish intellectual formed around 1900, an intellectual, I think, framed and formed by romantic nationalism, perhaps that's not surprising. If it's a politics that says there is value in the past because the past can inform the present, to disavow it wasn't possible for him. That's the end. Thank you very much.